Gentleman there, I think he's a border operator. He said, "Ebitala bikola mulumu mu wiki bali balya monyo." Okay, interesting there. He must have been either one of the residents or an proprietor or an operator of a school. That is a message. If I were one of the officials at City Hall responsible for ensuring that city lights across all intersections and junctions in the city are operational, that would be something to pay attention to. Allow me leave it at that and return to the studio for our Kickstarter conversation evaluating Uganda's democracy and governance. Now, that is something that should have you either on the edge of your seat or simply tightening your belt. Uganda and democracy. Since the turn of the century, Uganda's progression towards full democracy has seen significant gains and demand for democracy rather than its supply, marking a shift from a predominantly supply-led to a demand-led democratic regime. To speak to us about a survey that has been conducted and shows Uganda on the scale of countries that are either leading towards full democracy or continuously alienating itself, is Francis Kibirige. He's the National Coordinator of Afrobarometer Uganda, and he's here to give us that perspective. Welcome to the program, Mr. Kibirige.
Thank you very much for having us. It's a pleasure to be here to speak to Ugandans about the recent survey. Thank you.
The preamble alone sets the stage for what is no doubt an interesting discussion.
Absolutely.
Many times, Ugandans have not believed that the country might be as democratic as it is propped to be in certain circles across the world. We've grappled with a perception on aspects of governance where just about yesterday there was another report that was issued and it stated that the public believes less in government's ability to conduct matters of state effectively. But that is not the discussion today. You are from Afrobarometer Uganda. Afrobarometer itself has positioned itself as the survey masters when it comes to matters democratic, matters political, and as we head into 2026, most of the polls that will be coming out will be something to look forward to. But within the nuances of democracy and governance, you've been evaluating Uganda's place. Sure. Where are we generally?
Thank you very much for that wonderful preamble and that big question you are asking. Where are we? Our tracking data, 25 years today, shows that we've made progress in some aspects of democracy and we haven't made progress in other aspects of democracy. The statements you've read that show that we've shifted from more supply-led to more demand-led democratic regime implies that Ugandans in general, especially from our data, when we voted through that second referendum of 2005 to return to multi-party democracy, multi-party competition, we became more aware of what is it that this democracy means to us. And so we see today that the proportion of Ugandans who demand, who want, who desire for democracy have risen to now 62%. 62 of every 100 Ugandans we've spoken to say they prefer, they demand, they desire democracy. And we rank number 2 among 39 countries we surveyed up to last year.
39 across Africa?
Yes, 39 across Africa. But we rank 13th, number 13 out of 39, amongst those who say they see democracy, they are satisfied with the way democracy works in Uganda. So 62 of every 100 say they prefer, they demand, they desire democracy, only 34 see it. And that gap represents a duty for all of us, because let's reflect on this notion of democracy. Democracy doesn't work on the street. You can't see it and say, oh, there goes democracy.
Absolutely not.
But it is within us.
Yeah.
It's when we live those values of being
and
fair, free.
The dividends that come.
Yes, that's when we see democracy. So people out there are crying out loud for more and more of these values at play.
And that makes the question about what democracy really is one that ought to be explained sufficiently for an average Ugandan to know what to demand for, and also understand what they get when they are supplied democracy.
Again, a big question you ask. It could be a master's or PhD thesis in academia. But let me try to answer it in two simple answers, simple ways.
Yeah.
One, we've had this talk that democracy is foreign to us, that we Africans are used to something else rather than these values of democracy.
That's right.
What our data shows is contrary to that, that all, let me say Ugandans, irrespective of their gender, their residence status, whether in urban or rural areas, or even their education status, whether they are very educated or not very educated, we all prefer these values. As I said, fair, free, equal. Those, try out speaking to kids, even in nursery schools. Treat them differently. Give one something and don't give the other. They say, why not me? Because these are values God put in us.
That is right.
Secondly, unfortunately, we are not that strongly civic aware, a community, a people. We are not very well taught of our civic duties of a citizen in Uganda. And if one hasn't gone far up in tertiary institutions of learning, they probably will miss these lessons. But my mother in the village learns about democracy from what she sees our leaders promise, our leaders do in return.
Right.
Because it doesn't take a lot to figure out that this is what you said you're going to do and this is what you've done. This is what these values mean of free, equal, and this is what you are doing that doesn't show that. And we see this between our neighbors, we see it when we are in taxis, we see it when we are lining up for a service, and you can tell that this gentleman, this lady is not fair. That's it. Yes.
Wow, that is interesting. I love the analogy of the kindergarten, whereby everyone prefers something. That is down to choice.
Yes.
And when it comes to governance, democracy offers choices for people to decide who and what system of governance they might want. However, the power to make that choice is
individual.
Yeah, very individual most of the time. And the factors that influence each person are totally different. So much so that when it comes to the compound effect, you need to do aggregation, so to speak. And I'm sure that is the foundation of some of your surveys. You do sampling and then you aggregate the entire data. What is the sample spaces that you're using? You told me about 62%. That is the statistical angle.
Yes.
But I want to understand, if you are to go and ask questions to Ugandans, are they the Ugandans on the streets in Kampala? Are they the Ugandans on the roads across far-flung regions, going to fetch water, going to fetch firewood? Who are those Ugandans who can actually give you a very valid, a response in terms of how government rolls out services and what democracy really is, for you to be able to be conclusive enough that Uganda stands where you've ranked it?
We are able to do so because we follow a scientific rigor, a very rigorous process that allows us to do two big things. One is to consistently compare the Uganda of today to the Uganda of yesterday through these surveys, but also compare this Uganda to other countries. And we do so by following a scientific rigor that produces nationally representative sample surveys. By nationally representative, we mean that every respondent we speak to is randomly selected at different stages of selection. The process is random. Then second, our samples are matched to the national study population. And our study population are those citizens of Uganda who are resident of that randomly selected village and randomly selected households and are willing to take part in the study, and they are of adult age, 18 years and above.
Yeah.
So our surveys are conducted at the household. We use national sampling frames. We frequently work with or seek help from the Bureau of Statistics here in Uganda. And we also follow all the laws that are required by the country's, by the laws that govern conducting research, scientific research in Uganda through the Uganda National Council for Science and Technology.
Okay.
So what this then allows us to do is that within a known margin of error, we can speak to a sample of Ugandans that represents the rest of the population.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Let me return to the aspect of demand versus supply-led democracy regime rollout. What I deduct from your submission and what appears to be the greater picture is that there is more demand and less supply, and let's concentrate on the supply side. What are the factors that are constraining supply of democracy?
Being more demand-led means that the demand side factors are more prominent. And these demand side factors, if they are addressed, that curve that you're talking about will show a trajectory that moves Uganda towards a more full democracy by public opinion. And these factors are, for instance, accountability. People want to see responsible and accountable leadership. Secondly, if we, by any means, can have more efficient social service delivery and more efficient, more visible, intentional oversight role by institutions of government meant to play that role. And remember, many of us, I talked about Ugandans understanding democracy through different lenses.
That's right.
But one of those lenses is through these general elections we conduct. So most people remember during that time, that election cycle, that, oh, I'm doing my civic duty. And we are reminded to go out and do it. So many of us see the quality and the level of our democracy through that lens. And if we can improve the quality of our elections, for our elections to be seen to be more free, fair, credible, then those who see democracy will improve. Then there are those who see democracy in economic terms, who say, how can we be democratic when I don't have food? When I cannot afford school fees, when my land is being taken? How can we be a democracy when my life is not improving? And those voices also need to be met. And when these do happen, and others, so let's not forget. But in this report, we did highlight a series of issues that are impacting on how particularly people view this multi-party dispensation. The fact that many people are not happy, are not happy with the way especially political parties compete for office, that there is rising levels of violence, political violence, yes, the commercialization of elections, and also voters really not knowing who they are electing for. They elect people disregarding the mandate, and they evaluate them on a completely wrong mandate, and we see very high levels of turnover during elections, where more than 60% of incumbents don't return. And these issues, we see them as detrimental to the way people perceive, understand, and even relate. Today, we see that there are many people who are choosing not to feel close to any political party because of that chaos. Today,
that increasing alienation.
Yes. Today, the proportion who say they feel close to a political party are higher than the proportion who feel close to the ruling party or to the opposition party. And our tracking data show that this sparked off at a certain time, around 2019. And these are issues we need to address to realign the way multipartyism is working in Uganda, to give voters more control, but also to help the candidates to really do their, to serve their mandate. Because it is becoming increasingly difficult to serve in a role where you are being evaluated on a ground for which your mandate isn't based.
Yeah, that's a bit of the confusion lies there, and you cannot, for example, say the average Ugandan is on the wrong because the supply side for democracy has continued to give less.
Yes.
And this one, I must be able to quickly do some comparisons. Events in the UK over the last 1 week, described as an electoral Armageddon for the Tories, those are the Conservatives. Yep. I don't know whether they failed to understand that the undercurrents of the politics in the country had completely changed. But when you look at the supply of democracy in more democratic countries, or those ones that are acclaimed across the globe, we see a more people-centered approach, the tendency to put the people first. When the former Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, was speaking in his very last statement as he departed Downing Street, he apologized to the people. He said, "I am sorry, I have fallen short." This or such statements are never heard in democracies in Africa, where leaders are sorry for the actions of their establishment, sometimes their own actions, and the tendency to assume that whatever we give to the people, they must take. In other words, we must not at any one time find ourselves at a point of bother or even be shaken by what we have failed to do or done the wrong way.
Yes.
When you're surveying these sentiments across your sample spaces, how does it come out? Are we at a position where our own leaders, for example, are beginning to experience that fundamental shift, to begin to look at their service and holding of office as mandate by the people and for the people?
We talked about the demand side factors. I keep referring there because that's where our
your focus as a think tank and pollster.
No, as a country.
As a country.
Yes, for us to move forward, that's where we have a challenge. Now,
we have the challenge, but the opportunities lie more on the supply side.
Yes.
If we address those first.
I agree. Allow me give you this insight. Our leaders, if they were nurtured and brought to us from these very vibrant, strong, well-grounded institutions in the form of political parties, and with mechanisms that we can use, both we as voters and those political parties as institutions, to hold them accountable, yes, we probably would reach there. But the problem today is that our institutions are, we tend to say, weaker compared to the ones you mentioned.
That's right.
In the UK, for instance. Those are far way stronger. They have too many strong checks and balances that are not easy to change. Here we can change something before we test it. So the fact is that we need to realign these processes. And what we do in the Afrobarometer is to compare us to our peers. We will not get far comparing ourselves to these established democracies that have practiced democracy for longer than
3 centuries.
3 centuries, yes. We are not there. But if we compare our baby steps to our neighbors, to what our peers on the continent are doing, we can learn more.
Okay.
There are a lot of stories we can learn. For instance, in our data, if you look at that graph I know you've looked at, you will see countries in the tail end of that graph that shows commitment to democracy, that when that commitment is low, when that commitment is low, those states become too fragile and risk falling into autocracy. The militaries have taken over in those countries. When you see countries that are in the top end of that graph, then the public sentiment, the public agitation for democracy is stronger, and they tend to listen to them. What we need to do here is to coalesce these voices and to listen, to learn to talk. Our leaders don't talk. Did you know?
They don't talk to us, they talk at us.
Even among themselves. So we seem to be those traditional Northcoters. I was in Northcott. So we tended to say we either win or they lose.
All right.
And this this carrying forward in these public spaces, in multi-party competition, we need to see a lot more voices that bring people together to talk, to agree, and to accept where things have not gone right, to work together, to dialogue, to even in our communities. This is what is missing, because mistakes are made. And here and there leaders may even go wrong, okay? And we need, as a country, to learn to be resolute.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. That's very interesting and kind of deep, especially coming from Afrobarometer. You do, of course, spend a lot of time understanding sentiments, even within the corridors of power. Has there been an attempt, for example, for politicians who are well on the supply side of this curve to be able to begin to want to walk towards a change and understanding that democracy might not roll out the way people want it, or how we envisage it? Our own circumstances are different as communities and as countries. Is there anything or an attempt to come up with prototype democracy, so to speak, one that fits the African condition?
I think there have been a lot of discussion to try to quantify, to try to measure, to try to brand these sort of statements about democracy, equality, type. We in the Afrobarometer see democracy as democracy. It has no alternative. As I told you, the values, the ideals of democracy are the same. How can you substitute fairness? Even if you are an African or not an African, or a Cambodian or a Ugandan, what are you going to call it? It's fair, it's fair. It's being free, it's being free. So those values, we just need to translate them and integrate them in our own processes so that we begin to live them or see them at work. That's what strengthens or weakens our democracies.
That is right.
So, for instance, what I mentioned earlier, that if we've tended to build our political parties as institutions, by the way, Ugandans rank third in the preference for multi-party democracy.
Across Africa?
Yes. They want more political parties to give ourselves enough choice in who to choose to lead us. But they see a lot of violence. 77 of us see that many political parties are needed. 74 of every 100 see violence whenever these parties compete.
So every time there is an opportunity to embrace democracy, it runs into trouble.
Violence.
Violence.
And this violence is bred because of misconceptions, misalignments. For instance, our elections have become do or die. So we don't see this as a failure of democracy per se. It's a failure of us translating and living these ideals.
And now that leads me to ask the question, which complements the other best? Governance or democracy? What should we concentrate on? In the case, for example, of Singapore and Lee Kuan Yew, I think he chose governance ahead of democracy, and he was able to usher in a totally different dispensation that has allowed the country be where it is now. Theorists will reason and have their own posits on that, and they will be acceptably genuine when they say, but you see the changes are totally different. We were at one time statistically at the same point with Singapore as a country. Now where Singapore is, we cannot even begin to imagine we can stand in that on that stage with them, and that should offer us a point of reflection. Should we look at democracy as complementing governance and then not necessarily requiring that governance shifts and ensures that it fits within democracy?
I will go back to what I said earlier. There is no substitute to democracy. And I think the best way to approach this is not whether to emphasize more efficient social service delivery or more democratic norms and governance. What we should do is to look at ourselves in the mirror and identify our critical problems and in this democratic, under this democracy, and address them. They have been, you left out, I thought you were going to bring out the example of China. I was in one of our surveys on the continent. I was assigned to oversee this survey in Ethiopia. And our national partner there drove me in his car assembled in Ethiopia, in the Chinese car. And he was like, we make cars. And so, so sometimes people say, if people were able to have services, efficient services, you wake up and you know there is a health center well equipped.
That's right.
There is a school well equipped and of good standard. And there is a market where you will sell, trade in your goods and services. Would you really care about being fair, free, and equitable? And some people have tended to say, yes, maybe. We say no. They move together because they are both equally important.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. That's interesting. Let's take a break. This conversation is quite interesting. It's one that completely gets me to think about a lot more things, but I will have to ensure it is confined within the aspects of your survey that was done. MorningAtNTV does continue, no doubt, but we're going to have to say goodbye for now with regard to this particular issue. We are emboldened by your perspective, but most importantly, the fact that you have shared, and we do understand now a little better how democracy rolls out. Most Ugandans are still struggling to believe that we are number 2. Any last word?
We are number 2 in yearning for democracy.
Yearning for democracy.
We are number 13 in being satisfied with the way democracy works. The gap there is our responsibility, all of us Ugandans, to make sure that we are number 2 in yearning and number 2 or number 1 in seeing democracy at work.
Democracy at work.
Yes.
All right. Mr. Francis Kibirige, National Coordinator, Afrobarometer Uganda, many thanks. It's been a pleasure having you on MorningAtNTV. That will do it for the Kickstarter. MorningAtNTV does continue. Stay with us.